Good evening, everyone. I am Brittany Davis, and I am a licensed clinical social worker associate. And just to share a little bit more about myself, I obtained my BSW degree from Elizabeth City State University, and I obtained my MSW degree from the University of Michigan. And I am currently pursuing my PhD in social work at the University of South Carolina, and the added emphasis is for Dr. Davis. And so I'm really excited about our time together where I will be discussing trauma and trauma as it specifically relates to the African American community. And I must make the disclaimer that this video is for educational and informational purposes only. If you are experiencing a life-threatening event, please contact 911 or visit your local hospital. So first, I'll spend some time talking about what trauma is. And so I believe it's important to acknowledge that trauma has been defined in many different ways. And so many clinicians, including myself, have realized some of the limitations of the ways that trauma has been defined, including in the DSM-5, which is the manual that clinicians use to make mental health diagnoses. And so with that said, there are certainly experiences that would be traumatic for anyone who experienced them, but there are also subjective experiences that may be perceived as traumatic for one person, but not necessarily traumatic for another person. And so I believe it's important to acknowledge even those subjective experiences of trauma. And so, with that said, the definition that I'll provide is really intended to capture different experiences of trauma. And so I define trauma as any experience that threatens one's physical and or psychological well-being, including one's ability to cope and feel a sense of control. And it also changes one's view of themselves and of the world. And with trauma, there are often three levels of trauma that are used to describe its frequency and intensity. And so the first level is called acute trauma. And with acute trauma, this is trauma that results from a single traumatic incident. And then the next level is called chronic trauma. With chronic trauma, this is trauma that is repeated and it is prolonged. And so a little later, I'll give some examples of these different levels of trauma. And then the third level is complex trauma. And so with complex trauma, this is when a person experiences different types of traumatic events. And oftentimes with complex trauma, the trauma that the person experiences is of a interpersonal nature, which means that there's some type of relational component to their experiences of trauma. Given the definition of trauma and the different levels of trauma, I'll now provide some examples of trauma. And in no way is this list exhaustive of all of the different forms of trauma, but these are just some examples of trauma. And so they include domestic or family violence or dating violence, community violence, such as shooting, mugging, burglary, assault, bullying, childhood sexual or physical abuse or neglect, natural disasters such as a hurricane, a flood, a fire, an earthquake, a serious car accident, sudden, unexpected, or violent death of someone close, such as a suicide or a homicide, serious injury, major surgery or life-threatening illness, war. So, of course, for those who serve in the military, their witnesses of violence can be very much traumatic. Also, political violence. So, terrorism, for example, can be very traumatic. Other forms of loss, such as job loss, home loss, divorce, and also, even though a loss may not be a loss may be expected, it can still be a significant loss that can bring a level of trauma. And also, I want to speak to what we are experiencing now with the pandemic. And I think with the pandemic, it is even really challenged how trauma is viewed. And so, for many people, this pandemic has been very traumatic. For some people, the pandemic has led to the loss of a loved one. For others, it has led to the loss of employment. And for others, we've seen also increased rates of childhood abuse and domestic violence with the pandemic and the shelter in orders. And so I think it's important to really think about ways in which trauma can manifest. And going back to the different levels of trauma, so an example of acute trauma may be a serious car accident, that single event. And then with chronic trauma, an example is domestic violence, so reoccurring domestic violence and reoccurring childhood abuse. And an example of complex trauma is maybe a person experienced childhood abuse and then they also experience domestic violence in an intimate partner relationship. And maybe also they witnessed and grew up in a community in which they experienced and witnessed community violence. And so that's an example of complex trauma in the sense that a person can experience different types of traumatic events. So now I'll spend some time talking about trauma in the African American community. And so I really want to highlight ways in which, of course, African Americans, we have this history in the US of discrimination, of racism, and I want to draw attention to ways in which those systematic forms of racism and discrimination contribute to disproportionately higher rates of traumatic experiences in different ways. And so, for example, African American women, research has shown, experience disproportionately higher rates of trauma as compared to white women and are less likely to receive professional mental health services for those experiences as compared to white women. And in some of the previous sessions, we talked about the underutilization of mental health services for a variety of reasons among the African American community. But just let that sit for a moment, that African American women experience disproportionately higher rates of trauma and seek out services, mental health services, at a lower rate. And I think it's something that really deserves considerable attention given the ways in which I'll talk about mental health services can be an avenue for bringing about healing from traumatic experiences. Another thing I want to point out is the fact that, as David Roundtree discussed, homicide is one of the leading causes of death among African American men. So what this means is that as African Americans, we are more likely than our white counterparts to know someone personally, so whether that is a family member or a friend who has been murdered. And so even I have that personal experience of a male family member being murdered. And so with those disproportionate rates of homicide within the African American community, we are more likely to experience that form of trauma. Another thing, when you look at the intersection of race and poverty, so again, of course, we know that race and poverty have been really intertwined, and that again, African Americans have disproportionately higher rates of poverty than our white counterparts. And so, what that means is that African Americans also have disproportionately higher rates of growing up in a poverty-stricken community where they witness community violence. And so again, going back to the different types of trauma, community violence is a form of trauma that can be experienced. And so kind of tying into community violence, African Americans and as well as other groups of color such as the Latino population have higher rates of experiencing and or witnessing police brutality. And so we know again that this is due to systematic forms of racism and discrimination. And so the term racial trauma has been used to really describe traumatic experiences that are race based and have impacts on racially minority groups' psychological, emotional, and physical well being. And what is really sort of worth highlighting about this concept of racial trauma is that it shares symptoms. So when a person experiences racial trauma, whether that is it manifests through the form of police brutality or witnessing police brutality, the symptoms that people experience are similar to the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with that mental health diagnosis, it is a diagnosis that is directly linked to a person's experience of trauma. And a part of some of the symptoms that are associated with PTSD as well as racial trauma is re-experiencing the trauma, avoidance, trying to avoid situations that bring up memories or thoughts about the trauma, arousal or hypervigilance. Also, negative mood, negative cognitions. And these symptoms have also, although they are often associated with PTSD, they're also associated with the concept of racial trauma. And so, although there's not an official diagnosis of racial trauma, I think it's really, again, important to think about the ways that for African Americans, our experiences of racism and discrimination can cause us to experience trauma that is different from any other group, the dominant group. And so, given the definition of trauma, different levels of trauma, different types of trauma, and the impacts of trauma specifically within the African American community, I now want to spend some time talking about how experiences of trauma can impact the different dimensions of a person's well being. So, as we know, as human beings, we are multidimensional. And so, when a person experiences trauma, it often impacts the different dimensions of their well being. And first, I'll start with talking about some of the physical impacts of trauma. And so there is research supports that there is an increased risk of health problems with any form of trauma, particularly, I want to emphasize and clarify, unaddressed trauma. And so, for instance, past traumatic experiences can reduce the nervous system, which comprises our survival instincts. It can reduce its ability to distinguish between a genuine and a perceived threat, which can result in a persistent state of hyperarousal or hypervigilance, which, as I mentioned earlier, has been associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so domestic violence survivors and childhood sexual and physical abuse survivors often talk about how they knew from cues that sort of were a part of a maladaptive strategy. They could tell what type of day it would be in terms of abuse based on just how they had learned through bodily cues and through hypervigilance. They had learned and picked up within their environment and, were able to read the perpetrator. And so those experience that hyper sense of vigilance that one's develops out of a survival instinct can have some profound impacts on one's physical well-being. And so what we've seen is that this sort of constant state of hypervigilance, this constant state of really not addressing that hyper arousal, it can result in stress-related diseases and illnesses that impact the immune system, that impact the cardiovascular system, and that impacts the metabolic system. And so the ways in which trauma can manifest physically should certainly not be taken lightly. And again, particularly unaddressed traumatic experiences. And I also want to talk about the emotional impacts of trauma. So, one of the things with traumatic experiences, it can bring about feelings of helplessness, feelings of hopelessness, feelings of a lost sense of security, feelings of depression. And when those feelings, go unaddressed, they can really have some impacts on the quality of life that a person experiences. Also, in terms of cognitive impacts, traumatic life events have been associated with multiple psychiatric diagnoses, including anxiety disorder, major depression, PTSD, as I mentioned, and psychosis. So, what we often see as clinicians as we work with people who have been diagnosed with a mental health diagnosis, and as we kind of peel back the layers of those symptoms, oftentimes there is a history of trauma. And so, again, allowing or not addressing that trauma can have impacts on one's cognitive functioning. Also, I want to talk about spiritual impacts. Now, one thing I really want to mention about this is that, spirituality can certainly be an avenue that enables one to heal from their traumatic experiences. But also, for some people, their experiences of trauma can impact their sense of spirituality in a negative way. And for instance, I've known individuals who really started to deeply question and even in some cases abandon their faith in spirituality because of difficulties really trying to reconcile their beliefs, their faith with their experiences of trauma, and really not addressing it and not really, processing those experiences can impact, you know, something that is generally seen, particularly within the African American community, as a coping strategy. And so the other area that I want to talk about, that trauma can impact is social well-being. So we are obviously social creatures, and I know there are some personality types that are more social than others, but we all have a deep desire to feel connected and to be able to connect to others and feel safe in being able to connect with others. But when a person experiences trauma, particularly trauma that is of an interpersonal nature, it can really impact one's ability to be able to relate and feel safe in relationships, especially again when that trauma is unaddressed. And so oftentimes with marital counseling, as clinicians, what we see as we are, helping a couple maybe work through some marital discord, that as we help the couple sort of unravel the root causes of their marital issues, oftentimes, and of course, this is certainly not all the time, but sometimes there is this issue of trauma not being addressed, whether from the husband or the wife, and because of not addressing that trauma, it has led to issues in marital issues, because of maybe feeling unsafe or not feeling secure or not, and not addressing those issues can impact the quality of relationships, and they can also impact one's enjoyment in social activities. So again, trauma and different types of trauma really have a way of impacting one's sense of safety and trust. And so, for some people who've experienced or had traumatic experiences, they may refrain from engaging in certain social activities that may actually be enjoyable for them, because of those experiences of trauma. So, again, it's really important to think about the different ways in which trauma can impact the different dimensions of our well being. So, I know in hearing the different impacts of trauma, it can really be overwhelming and even, depressing, especially if you've experienced trauma. But I come to leave you with hope. And so, since this is, mental health awareness, particularly for the African American community, I want to say, to my Black sister, you can heal from your trauma. And I want to say to my Black brothers, you can heal from your trauma. And so I want to talk about the role of therapy in healing from trauma. And so, in no way is this to suggest that in order for a person to heal from trauma, they have to go through therapy. In no way, because obviously people can heal from trauma who never go through therapy. However, I do want to highlight and really emphasize that therapy can be one tool, it can be one strategy, and it has been shown to be effective to help people heal from trauma. And so, one way in particular that therapy can be beneficial in terms of healing from trauma is through establishing the therapeutic relationship. That in and of itself has been shown to be an avenue for healing. So being able to trust someone that you can process your trauma with in a way that is safe, that feels safe, and in a way that you feel that you are able to connect and trust a person. One of the things I know for us as Black women, we tend to take on everybody else and everybody's problem and often neglect our own needs and our own problems and often don't address our own traumas because oftentimes we have all the right answers for everyone else except ourselves. And so having that therapeutic relationship with the therapist, someone that you can trust, and even for Black men too who I always say bear a different weight from society, just again through the history of racism and oppression and how different things that were designed to literally break the Black man down, and how sort of as a survival and resilience strategy, Black men have felt to uphold this strong, persona. But again, for Black men, many of you have experienced trauma that maybe haven't been addressed, and even your ability as well to be able to connect with someone you trust and that you can process your trauma with can be really beneficial. Also, in terms of therapy, there are proven therapeutic techniques that are effective and that many clinicians are trained in to help people heal from their trauma. And so these are techniques that have been supported by research evidence, by practice evidence to really be effective in terms of healing from trauma. And so therapy in that sense of, engaging in strategies and techniques that are proven to help one reach that next level of freedom in their lives can certainly be a way in which therapy can also be an avenue for healing from trauma. So, again, I look forward to any questions you all have about our session tonight. And thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this series.
Hi Facebook, this is Dr. Renee again. I hope you enjoyed our presentation on trauma presented to you by Miss Brittany Davis, licensed clinical social worker associate, who is also, as she said in her clip, a PhD doctoral student. Miss Brittany, welcome. You did a phenomenal job, phenomenal. So before we get started, as we did last week, you're looking at me, as we did last week with Mr. Roundtree, Facebook, we have t-shirts. So today's t-shirt, if you can see, it says some wounds are invisible, mental health awareness. And so we decided that this would be a great t-shirt to wear, because when we talk about trauma, oftentimes with the person who's been through that traumatic experience, we may not know that they've gone through something, and so they hide it. And so this is the purpose of the t-shirt, is that there are invisible wounds that we can't see. We can see if someone has a bruise. We can see somebody acting out at times. but someone who is holding things down or holding things in and they just don't want to talk about it. They are holding in that wound, they are holding in that trauma. So this is the purpose of this t-shirt. I did have an opportunity to look at Miss Brittany's video, and she did two things I want y'all to know. She made a shout out to her university. She said the University of South Carolina, and then she even called me out, Facebook. I don't know why she did that. I mean, I love these Gamecock fans. You know, I just can't help that. You know, they made a poor choice in their university. Nothing against USC, but you know, I'm a die-hard Carolina fan. Love my Tar Heels. Will always represent my cup here. But Facebook, this is all love here. As you see on the table, Miss Brittany brought some, she brought her own game plan. So she has here a Gamecock tumbler. So you want to talk about that, Miss Brittany?
Yes. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is really to clarify, because Dr. Davis really caught my colleague, David Roundtree, off guard last week. And so this is to set the record straight. This is the true Carolina.
Oh, no.
So in case there are any people who may be confused, like Dr. Davis out there, I just want to show that this is the true Carolina.
First university in the country, UNC Chapel Hill. All right. We are having fun, ladies and gentlemen, Facebook. We love each other. We're just having fun here. And what I would like to say is, with Ms. Davis, Brittany Davis, Mr. Roundtree, they're coming on board with me at Brighter Horizons, and know that we are going to have so much fun just going back and forth with each other. But we also are coming together because we realize how important mental health is. And so we want to provide quality, empirically based services to the public. So it's all fun. It's all fun. It's all fun. All right. So without any further ado, we're going to go into our Q&A, Facebook. We do have one question already. Oh, we don't have a question yet from our audience. I have been cued by the producer here to ask everyone, please type in your questions. We are going live, so as you type the questions, someone will read the questions to us, and we will answer the questions. Again, today's topic is on trauma. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, I do have a couple of questions for Miss Brittany. Miss Brittany, how long does it typically, no, wrong, wait a minute. Yeah, that's it. I'm sorry. Someone who has gone through a traumatic experience, let's say they kept it in, didn't want to talk about it. Can they get some type of healing, some type of support if, let's say, 20 years down the road, they decide that they want to seek therapy?
Absolutely. I definitely say that, you know, no matter when a person starts their healing journey, you know, from their traumatic experiences, they can heal from their trauma. There have certainly been people who may have started their journey a little later in life, and they have still been able to go on and experience a level of freedom from past traumatic experiences. And so I think it's important too to think about, even that question brings to mind the older generation and the era that, in particular, child abuse survivors from the older generation that grew up in an era and a climate when it was a culture of secrecy. So now there's much more education around child abuse. There's much more, you know, advocacy around bringing awareness. So for many people, it feels safer than, you know, maybe past eras when it was more of a culture of secrecy. So for some people, it may have took 20, 30 years to finally feel like they are at a place where it's safe to process their trauma. And as they say in my church, as long as the blood is still running warm in your veins, you can heal from your traumatic experience.
Very good response. How do I know if I have unaddressed trauma?
That's a good question. I definitely think it's important to, if a person feels like, they know they've had like a past traumatic event and they have certain concerns around. I think it's always important to have some type of assessment or evaluation, but just to kind of give some general signs. So going back to the presentation, thinking about your life and thinking about the different ways in which trauma can impact different dimensions of a person's life, and begin to think about, is there ways in which my past trauma impacts my relationships? Is it ways in which it impacts my ability to feel safe in relationships? It impacts my ability to feel secure in relationships, to be able to connect with people in a way that feels safe. Then also think about, is my trauma impacting my emotional well-being? Am I experiencing emotional distress over my past traumatic experience? To what extent am I experiencing emotional distress? How is it impacting? Am I constantly thinking about it? Am I constantly feeling depressed about it? Or are there things that seem to trigger it? Another thing is, am I engaging in unhealthy behaviors to try to numb the pain from my past traumatic experience? I think that's another thing. How am I coping with this right now? And those can certainly be some indicators to let a person know whether or not they have some unaddressed trauma.
So what would you say would be some unhealthy coping skills that someone would rely on after a traumatic event?
Absolutely. So one is definitely substance abuse. So, we know substance abuse is a maladaptive coping strategy. And so for many people who struggle with substance abuse, when you sort of peel back the layers of the reason why they abuse, oftentimes there is some unaddressed trauma. And so a way to sort of numb out the pain of their traumatic experience, they may engage in substance abuse because they've learned that that's one way, at least temporary, I can numb out the pain of the experience. And so I think that's one example of a coping strategy. I think another one may be just being so withdrawn to the point that it's unhealthy. You're so isolated and you don't have any connections. And like I said in the video, we are social creatures. We all have a deep desire to feel connected to somebody. It may not be everybody, but somebody we desire. It's a part of our makeup to be able to feel like we can connect. And so when a person is extremely isolated, as if to say, I'm keeping myself safe, but at the same time you're caging yourself in, that can certainly be an indicator of a maladaptive coping strategy as well, I would say.
What are your thoughts on an individual who has been sexually abused as a child, but then we see this promiscuity in teenagers? What are your thoughts on why does that happen?
Right, absolutely. So when you think about child development, and when a child experiences something that is not supposed to happen to them and they're violated in a sexual way, it's very confusing. It's, their aspect, even depending on the age where their brain event hasn't fully developed. And so that can certainly create issues that impact their sexuality. And so it can create this sense of, in their mind, maybe this is normal behavior, or this is how I receive love, or this is how, because something in their development has been really disrupted, in a way that impacts, again, going back to the definition of trauma, it impacts how they see themselves and it impacts how they see the world.
So not just with sexual childhood trauma, what are some, hold that question,
Okay.
I'll come back to it. Because we have a question from our Facebook audience.
Yes. Question is, does trauma present the same in children and adults?
That's a great question. I would definitely say, especially depending on the development of the child, a child's brain hasn't fully developed the cognitive component that you see in adults. So a lot of ways in which they sort of externalize their emotions is through their behavior. And so, oftentimes you may see, and this can happen in adults too, but for children, since they're not able to say, hey, I've experienced this trauma and it's impacted me this way, they may lash out in anger. You may start to see sort of withdrawal behaviors from adults that they trust. And another thing that can really occur in adults and children is disturbances in sleep patterns. And, with PTSD, one of the symptoms for some people is having nightmares, around the trauma, and having disturbances in sleep around the trauma. And so I think there are ways in which there are some similarities, but taking into consideration the development of a child is obviously different from an adult. So the way they may externalize it may be somewhat different than in adults.
And that kind of follows the question I was going to ask. Example, a parent learned that their child may have been traumatized, may have something negative, bad had happened to them. What are some of the signs, symptoms, behaviors, behavior problems that they might see in their child that a parent needs to be very mindful of?
Right. So in particular for sexual abuse, so one of the things that you may notice is some inappropriate sexual behaviors from a child that you notice that are, super advanced. Of course, we know there are certain developmental things where children kind of trying to make sense of, their bodies, their sexual, but things that are like advanced, or they're starting to use language that is really advanced. That's one indicator for sexual abuse. Another one is, let's say that a child is all of a sudden starting to bedwet, or all of a sudden, that this has not been an issue, they're beyond their age, but you're seeing all of a sudden they're bedwetting. Or like I said earlier, maybe they are withdrawn from trusted adults. Maybe they are having problems at school, and all of a sudden this is a straight A student, and this student you've never had issues with, but all of a sudden you're seeing issues at school. There's a lot of different indicators that can cue a parent in to that their child may have been a victim of child sexual abuse.
Okay. We have a question from the audience, but let me just real quickly follow up. Tell our Facebook audience about the regression of some skills that we may see, parents may see if a child who has been traumatized.
Yeah, so definitely regression, as I mentioned, as far as bedwetting behaviors, is certainly an indicator. For some children, some can become withdrawn, but some can become more clingy too. That's another, they can just be more clingy, and you wonder why all of a sudden it's just like they're so afraid, the intense fear of being away from their parent, separating from a parent. That can certainly be a reaction to trauma as well. So yeah.
All right. I have a question from Facebook.
We actually have two. I'll start with one, but
Yes.
make sure you come back. When you notice a person deals with a trauma and the person refuses to get help, is there a way to peacefully help them to recognize triggers that you notice?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one thing when it comes to when someone has experienced trauma, I think we can never underestimate the power of empathy. Because sometimes when we care about people, it's our tendency, we want to fix them, we want to fix the situation, and in doing so, sometimes it can make us come off as like we're trying to preach to the person, as we're trying to tell them what to do. But taking a moment, stepping back and empathizing and understanding and saying to them, I know you experienced this, and I know it must have been hard, and I can see how your experience of that may make you feel this way, or make whatever you've observed, really drawing attention. And I can understand, if I was in your shoes, I can imagine I would probably respond this way too, and really engaging them. And like I said, empathy is so powerful because it disarms people, because they don't feel like they have to be defensive. They don't feel like you're coming at them as if so that you know it all, or you're trying to fix them. But it disarms them to say, okay, maybe they get it. And so once those defenses are down, that's often a good opportunity to say, well, let's talk about how this has impacted you. And I notice when such and such happens, you seem to get really upset. Let's talk about that. Let's process that. And so I think once people's guards are down, they're in a place where they can begin to process and walk through their journey of healing.
And then also providing that support, encouraging them when they are ready if it's an adult, when they are ready to seek professional assistance. So, was there another question?
There was. Excuse me, there was. What can we offer to our youth who may be traumatized? Many recreational centers are closed in older communities.
Okay. In older communities? So are they asking at this moment?
I believe so.
Okay, all right. Well, I do know that, as we all know, that we are in this COVID era, and a lot of recreational centers are closed, but there's mental health facilities that are open. A lot of these facilities are providing virtual groups. So in a group where they are working with other individuals around their same age group, working on similar skills, talking through what they have experienced. Can you think of anything else other than like the virtual groups that are out there?
Right, and that's what I was kind of going to speak to, is the virtual group. So I know there are different virtual groups that are being held for youth, in a way for them to connect through the virtual groups. And depending on if a youth, is involved in church, I know there are multiple youth groups that are being held through church organizations for youth to connect in that way. So that can definitely be given, what we're facing right now, a way for them to feel connected.
Any more questions off of Facebook? Not yet. All right, guys, keep it coming. Keep it coming. Give us an example, Ms. Brittany, of a form of therapy that has been proven effective in dealing with trauma.
Right. So there's something called trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. And so what that is, so cognitive behavior therapy in general is a technique that recognizes that cognition, so a way a person thinks, impacts how they feel and can impact their behavior. So with trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, it is a therapeutic technique that is sensitive to a person's experience of trauma, and it realizes and understands how that experience of trauma may have created distortions in their thinking. So for example, some people who've experienced sexual assault, they blame themselves. And so there are some cognitions around their experience that need to sort of be dealt with and addressed, so that it can impact obviously their emotions and their behavior and their response. So trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy research supports that it has been very effective with children, adolescents, and adults.
Okay. Any questions so far? So, Ms. Brittany, in your video, you talked about post-traumatic stress. So tell our audience, explain to our audience how, let's say, the smell of cologne or hearing of a certain song can trigger someone to just relive that event, even though, let's say, it happened 10 years ago.
Right, yeah. So one of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, as Dr. Davis stated, was this idea of reliving the past trauma, to where, whether it's a smell, whether it's something someone says, whether it's a location, that brings up that traumatic experience, and it causes a level of distress for the person, because it's literally like they're in that moment again and re-experiencing that pain all over again. And so kind of again going back to trauma focused cognitive behavior therapy can be an avenue or a strategy to help with some of that distorted thinking that's attached to certain, whether it's a smell or a memory or something that's triggered. It can kind of help a person better process, so they're not sort of reliving that experience again.
Okay. All right, wonderful. We do have another question from our Facebook audience.
Is there a time frame for trauma to manifest, or can it lay dormant and be triggered unpredictably?
That's a good question. I would definitely say, people experience trauma different ways and have different reaction to it. So for some people, maybe shortly after the trauma, they begin to have reactions. But for other people, there's a concept called repression. So maybe they repress that memory, or they repress as a way, sort of almost as a survival technique, the brain has
Burying it deep.
Yeah, burying it deep, right? And it doesn't come up until maybe some life experience trigger it, or maybe some major transition in life, maybe your marriage or something, or having a child or something really brings it to surface. So I would definitely say people respond differently, and trauma can impact people differently. Would you like to add anything?
No, I mean, I was gonna like add examples that I've had in working with people. I've had women come in who were abused as a child, repressed it, but then when they became mothers themselves, it brought back all of the pain that they were experiencing. They likely were projecting onto their child what had happened to them, and the fear that I don't want this to happen to my child, but then they have all of this unresolved issues that's causing distress now in their adult lives. All right, so absolutely, yes. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we have another question from Facebook.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
How is trauma addressed for people that have a low cognitive level or developmental disability?
Oh, I think that's in your ballpark.
What? Oh my goodness. Wow, so how is it addressed like in terms of therapy? One, you have to meet the person where they're at, talking to them in language in which they understand. You know, oftentimes if someone has extremely low cognitive abilities, it may be difficult to do the cognitive behavioral therapy. So then oftentimes you just may work with them on the behavior itself. If they were having maladaptive behaviors or behaviors that are not socially appropriate, then working with them on that behavior to try to find a more appropriate replacement behavior. Did you agree with that?
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Okay. All right, any other questions? All right, I think we have
Yeah,
I think we have time for one more, and then Facebook, we are going to wrap things up. Let's see.
How long?
How long? Oh, how long does it take for a person to heal from trauma?
Yeah, so I would definitely say that, you know, the healing journey for two people can look totally different, and I don't think you can necessarily put a time stamp on the journey of healing from trauma. So, you know, for instance, for one person who decides to take the journey of healing through therapy, it can take them maybe several months to start to feel a sense of control, you know, over their lives, and to start to feel that they're able to use more positive coping strategies. For another person, it could take years, because again, thinking about their different types of trauma, there's different sort of levels of intensity, different ways in which trauma impacts a person, so it can certainly be different for two people. And one thing I like to point out in terms of therapy, and something that can potentially delay a healing process, is oftentimes when people begin therapy and they start to process those traumatic experiences, it can bring up painful memories. And so for some people, when they experience that pain, they're like, you know what, I've already experienced enough pain with this, and they jump ship from the therapy process because they don't want to experience any pain from it. But what I like to say, and I really encourage people to stick it through, because just as in a natural sense, when you're healing, there's often a level of pain and discomfort that is a part of the healing process. And so right now I'm going through physical therapy for a running injury. And my physical therapist said, these exercises that I'm giving you, you're going to feel some pain with it. You're going to feel some discomfort because the muscle is healing. It's this way of repairing from the injury. And so it's similar when it comes to trauma and healing from trauma. And so I encourage people to not jump ship when those painful experiences come up, because oftentimes it's a part of your healing process. And another thing is with therapy that can hinder the process is sometimes people come looking for the therapist to fix them, as if they don't have to put any work into the process. And so coming with that sort of misconception can be a barrier too, because really therapy is a partnership. It's the therapist and the person working together to work through the trauma. And so there's work, so to speak, that a person must be willing to commit to for their own healing as well.
You know, I often try to say that with the consumers and the clients that come in, that they are my co-therapists.
Mhm.
Because they know
Absolutely.
themselves better than anybody else. And so we're coming together to try to help them improve their life and family situation. We have another question?
Yes, and this is a good one. How do we get this knowledge to our communities?
You want to take that? Because I was about to say, share this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
Make sure you share this video, like it. We're going to have more information towards the end of this segment. But what I would say is definitely share this video. It has wonderful information. Ms. Brittany did a phenomenal job presenting on trauma. Were you going to add anything else?
yeah, and we're definitely, I guess, Dr. Davis, I'm sure would agree with this. We're open to presenting. If you all have any places you would like us to present, to share this information, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to meet with anyone to share this information to other community members.
And y'all, she's from Gaston County. You know, we in Gaston County, we like to say homegrown. Ms. Brittany is homegrown, right? You're from Gaston County,
You
right?
know, I'm actually from Mecklenburg County, but
As close enough, but she's living in Gaston County right now.
Right,
So
absolutely.
we accept her, we embrace her. She's one of us now. Okay, another question from Facebook.
Alrighty. How should paraprofessionals go about determining that a trauma has occurred during this period of remote teaching and learning? Are there additional signs we could or should look for?
Hopefully the paraprofessional is working in tandem with a professional, and so they're having those consultations. Oftentimes it's the professional, be it a clinician, is helping the paraprofessional with some activities. And so when they're in that planning stages, that would be an opportunity to speak with that clinician. Hopefully that clinician is also working with that individual as well. But some of the signs, if we're talking about children, you know, some of the symptoms that Ms. Brittany talked about, the anger and the rage, changes in appetite, sleeping, difficulty being soothed, some regression in their developmental skills, a strong startle response that is almost like an overreaction to a situation, frequent stomach aches, headaches. When I want to talk about regression, I know Ms. Brittany talked about it as well, but it can be you have an 8-year-old who is very verbal, and then they're now talking as if they're 3 years old. So those are things that you can kind of look for in children, and definitely talk with their parents or legal guardian and the professional mental health clinician that is involved on the case, because there should be a mental health clinician that is involved whenever there's a paraprofessional. So ladies and gentlemen, Facebook, it is time for us to wrap things up. Ms. Brittany, thank you. Welcome aboard. I am so happy to have you here at Brighter Horizons. Ladies and gentlemen, mom and dad, she works with adolescents as well as adults. She has this gift. So I think she's phenomenal. So on behalf of Brighter Horizons Psychological Services, as well as the Gastonia Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, we thank you for joining us over these past 4 weeks. We had 3 phenomenal presenters. We had April Holoka talk about Mental Health 101. We had David Roundtree talk about suicide in the African American community, and tonight we had Miss Brittany Davis, who is working on her PhD, y'all, talking about trauma. We also want to inform you that this is not the last time you guys are going to see us. The sorority and I, we are talking about other topics that we are going to present. We're talking about a back to school presentation for students as well as parents in this virtual environment. We're talking about putting on a financial awareness seminar and some other ideas that we have coming your way. So please share. Please check our Facebook page as well as our YouTube page for additional information. And also, if you don't mind, please check notifications So whenever we put out some new information, you will be one of the first ones to get that little ding on your phone or on your computer to let you know that the sorors of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated are coming at you.
You want one more funny question?
Yeah.
Our buddy David said, is trauma experienced by Tar Heels after leaving the football field with Gamecocks?
Absolutely.
Are we live?
Every
We
time.
are still
It
live.
is,
Okay, let me tell you.
it's complex trauma. It's complex.
Okay,
Because
okay,
it happens multiple different times. It's complex trauma. Thank you, David.
Okay, so there's a question.
Thank you, David.
Who won the last football game?
We did.
No, y'all did.
I haven't checked, but I know we did.
We did. I think it was last year we beat y'all in Charlotte.
I don't know.
Oh,
Yes,
boy.
we did. Go Heels! All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. I hope you have learned a lot of good information that you can apply to your personal lives, your social lives, benefit yourselves as well as your loved ones. Take care. We at Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and Brighter Horizons, we love you. Mwah!